Hi, I'm Michael, and this series presents a deep dive into a secret that I've been keeping for most of my life, but one that should never have been kept at all. It's my hope that learning my secret and the insights it has given me will help you understand either your own secrets or those of at least one person near to you. These audio episodes were originally recorded and released as a single 7.5 hour long video on YouTube. That video was really just me talking to the camera, so other than a few title cards, one thumbnail, and some body language for context, you're not really missing anything by listening rather than watching. Either way, you'll hear my message. That said, I only got asked to make an audio version after the original video was completed and released, so please understand that this introduction, my spoken trigger warnings, and the episode structure and breaks have all been hacked and hammered in after the fact, and please also excuse the few references to this video and the thumbnail. I don't think there will be anything too confusing in audio form, but if there is, a link to the original video is in the show notes. Also in the show notes will be links to any references and resources I mentioned in this episode. There are 8 episodes in total. Please only listen to them in order, as that order has been very carefully and very painfully chosen. This is episode 3 out of 8, my first education. It discusses my personal experience of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, and that requires discussion of specific episodes of physical and sexual violence towards a child, neglect and abuse of a child, and CPTSD and disordered eating as those developed in a child. Hi, I'm Michael, and I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I have a very severe and for significant portions of my life entirely disabling mental illness, and I need to tell you more about my experience with it in the hope that others will be able to recognize it in themselves or in others and try and work towards getting it diagnosed and hopefully treated. Like many kinds of mental illness, it's not widely known or talked about outside of the circles of care that build up around someone in active crisis. And for those who don't suffer from it or support someone who does, it can be very hard to recognize. In my case specifically, if you're not paying very close attention over a pretty significant amount of time, it's essentially invisible. But the simple truth is, it has deeply affected me and those who love me on a moment-by-moment basis for as long as I've been able to form memories. It started with an extremely traumatic preschool experience, but unfortunately that went untreated. And then further traumatic experiences compounded what might otherwise have been a single static episode of PTSD into a chronic, lifelong, dynamic disease for which there are not really any effective treatments, yet at least, and which may very well end up killing me. It brought with it periods of severe and debilitating depression lasting years in a row. It left me in a persistent and exhausting state of always engaged, ludicrously reactive hypervigilance that has had me scanning for threats and weapons and escape routes even from the quietest rooms I've been in when I've been in them alone. An obsessive behavior I didn't even start to recognize or realize was unusual until I read by accident about a veteran developing it only after surviving an IED explosion in an actual war. It has left me with significant dissociation, which has manifested as both intense depersonalization and derealization, and learning to manage all of that has led to obsessive compulsive behaviors that have at times severely impacted my life and my career. Some of those, like my eating disorders, were learned from external sources, but the majority were the flawed tools I assembled along the way to try and cope with the chaos within. In me, the urge to recapitulate was so powerful, intrusive, disturbing, and compelling from an early age that it led to re-victimization that was far, far worse than the initiating event. From there, I developed control mechanisms I can only describe as pathological, including near constant suicidal ideation, and various forms of compulsive self-harming and self-injuring behaviors, and those include the means by which I have gone through both enormous weight gains and enormous weight losses, only the most recent of which may have gotten you to click on this video. As I've just described in a very simplified overview, the criteria and names for things have shifted around me during my life, so over the decades I've had multiple diagnoses. The early ones were very inappropriate, outright wrong, and harmful. But they became progressively more accurate as time went on, and I got a tiny little bit better at communicating, while my species got a tiny little bit further from baboons and bloodletting. Because I'm talking about a subject that really is just at the beginning of the beginning, it's hard to stick a pin in things and call them done, and my diagnosis will continue to get refined and the name and definition might change again in the future, especially if I ever move back to a country that only uses the DSM. But today, according to the definitions in the ICD-11 that's used here in the UK, my current diagnosis is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The problem is the criteria and the diagnosis are still incomplete. They're ludicrously crude tools built up over years by well-meaning people with limited or no experience actually living with the condition. And then they're used by even cruder healthcare systems to determine if you do or do not get care which is itself almost always limited to, at most, a kind of fumbling talk therapy that has only slightly more real and reproducible science behind it than astrology. As I've sketched out, getting there took an initial trauma that didn't get treated, leading to PTSD that didn't get treated, leading through failures of people and systems to CPTSD that, for the most part, also hasn't been treated. It's just been survived and endured. It's destroyed relationships, it's caused long-term damage to my body, and it's severely inhibited my ability to contribute to both my family's life and my society. Now, it's not all been bad. I've endured it relatively well. I was lucky enough to develop compulsions and compensatory mechanisms that made it possible for me to be one of the really high-performing ones, which meant I did actually have a pretty good career, and I've been able to hold down a very good job during the periods between my fugoid's bigger extremes. And that let me pay to access a very good therapist for long enough that I was able to enter a kind of remission and balance with my disease, which was teetering a bit after COVID, but not falling over right up until I got kicked in the head. See, I've had a hand in and I have responsibility for all of that, both those successes and those failures. That's because the symptoms of PTSD and CPTSD are inherently psychosomatic. Sadly for you, that word may well be yet another kind of thought-terminating cliche. Psychosomatic does not mean physical symptoms that exist only in the mind. It means physical symptoms induced by the mind. Well, as I've said, the human mind is the single most important organ to a human life. That simple fact implies it can also be the single greatest contributor to human suffering. You and me, we inhabit the only species we know has created thermonuclear weapons. Our minds did that. Now, you might not feel particularly close to the minds that can contemplate fusion physics, but the average human mind alive today, if given sufficient resources, a big enough library, and a good enough librarian, could, eventually, assemble themselves a hydrogen bomb. That spongy, greasy, squidgy thing between your ears can unleash the power inside a star. It's a learning and prediction engine that is, as far as we can tell, the single most complex machine the universe knows, maybe has ever known, possibly may ever know. It's a weapon, an incredibly powerful weapon. If you don't think it can seriously screw up the hormones, organs, and muscles it's directly connected to, just by misdirecting all that power, then it's entirely possible you've got a more problematic mental illness than I do. I've been able to harness my very badly injured brain to some good effect. I've survived and endured, and because of an abundance of luck, even thrived, but I have always been limping along on what remained of a metaphorical leg that had been blown off beneath me. Unfortunately for my own long-term health, I haven't been able to access the care I have always needed. Because, well, frankly, that care barely exists. That's the world's contribution. But also because part of surviving and enduring, for me, has been hiding the details from anyone I didn't trust, not to hurt me further. And the simple truth is, my disease robbed me of the ability to trust any human being, including myself, a long time ago. Any attempt I made to disclose my secret and its history over the years backfired so badly, so catastrophically badly, from so early on, that surviving and enduring meant keeping that secret, always from others, but even at times and in part from myself. And if my body hadn't gotten thin, and thinned the walls I'd built inside my brain around that trauma along with it, and that thinner, lighter body hadn't ended up getting kicked in its thinner, lighter skull, then I'd probably still be keeping my secret. Because my skull did get kicked, I've spent the last 2 years, again, being forced to disclose my diagnosis and my history and hints about my secret over and over for hundreds of times to a ridiculously long sequence of therapists and administrators and bureaucrats, each of whom I've then had to extend my wounded trust towards in order to educate them in how to treat me and, more importantly, how not to harm me further. And most of them, if I'm being generous, have then gone on to harm me further anyway. That experience has finally pushed me to realize that keeping my secret has only ever helped the perpetrators keep perpetrating and help the ignorant stay ignorant. That it's enabled your confirmation bias, but it's never actually helped me, and it's certainly never helped anyone else like me. That's why I have to walk you through the whole journey, why I've had to introduce myself to you in this way, and why I've now got to expose some of the details in the story of how I came to know my secret. Doing so will not be easy or pleasant, and will require disclosing some extremely uncomfortable truths about my experience. At the end, you'll know why I first gained and then lost the weight, why I gained and then lost it several more times, and how I've lost and now kept it off this time. But also why the weight is not the important part at all. If you're not like me and don't share my experience, then my hope is through my story you'll better understand those who do have such experiences. And sadly, we're nowhere near as rare as you might either think or hope. If you are anything like me, and I cannot express to anyone just how much or how deeply I hope that you are not, you'll hopefully have some idea that you're not alone and that there is a path forward. That path isn't easy. It isn't one you should be on. And walking it will, I'm sorry, take every remaining step of your lifetime. It's not, I'm afraid, a path to a cure. I can't promise you that. But I can say that the path we're on doesn't have to lead to catastrophe. It definitely doesn't need to involve any more harm to either yourself or to others. If you're anything like me at all, then it's you, and you alone, that has the power to stop both. That power has been with you since day zero. It's the thing that terrifies you when you catch yourself looking out of the mirror. The following passage contains brief descriptions of violence towards a child. Hi, I'm Michael, and everything I know as life began because on some day in August 1980, on my first day of school, in a bathroom stall not far from my kindergarten class in Palmdale, California, I was murdered. Now that might sound like hyperbole, like something I'm saying to be dramatic or to get attention, but you're just going to have to extend me a little more trust here, because it's not. It's taken me more than 4 decades of work and effort and aching bodily pain you probably can't even fathom to get to the point I can say this in public. The last thing I want is attention for this. I don't want light shone into my dark places. What I always wanted was attention for the good things I did with and because of my dark places. But some bastards came along and kicked me in the head and cracked the wall I'd built around all of this. A wall that had gotten thin precisely because my body had gotten thin. And now the dark things are loose, and it's time to speak about the unspeakable. I'm not saying this because I want attention. I'm saying this because I want someone else with hidden, dark things to know they're not completely and utterly alone. The following passage contains descriptions of experiences of dissociation, depersonalization, and derealization. I mean it when I say I was murdered that morning. The thing I knew as Mike really did, in every conceivable sense, die. And the thing I eventually started asking people to call Michael, the thing you know by that name now, just kind of continued on. You might notice that I call both of them things. And to me, they always have been, because that's how depersonalization and derealization, as experienced by preschool-age children, can play out. There was the body of a little boy who never got up off the floor of that bathroom stall, and there's what remains. The body of the boy, and then the man that came home. The body both my father and my mother later and independently told me wasn't the same person that had left that morning. The thing you recognize in the mirror, the thing you think of as me, I don't have that. And I haven't since the first day of school. I have never, not once in my life, since looked in a mirror and seen me looking back. I see a body, a corpse my mind has been entombed within. It turns out this is a kind of common artifact of the worst cases of CPTSD. It takes that idea of a foreshortened future I mentioned previously and grinds it up way past 11. I read about it recently in a paper about actual torture victims, and in their stories, as they're struggling to explain themselves to a researcher who really has no idea what they're asking, it was just so painful to see someone else, really for the first time in my life, reflect back that same sense of just being stuck inside the thing that kept breathing. After the thing we call a life came face to face with cold, dark, certain oblivion and was forced to keep looking at it, with no hope of ever turning away. I'm not alone, but it's really hard for people like me to just run into and recognize each other. And it's not like we're encouraged to talk about our experiences. I've never met anything quite like me face to face, even amongst others with CPTSD, which might well mean they don't know I exist either. Now, if you've watched our videos, especially the ones before we completed our mad dash around the canals and rivers of England and Wales, and before I started to lose weight, you're probably feeling a bit of a disconnect here. You've seen me smiling, you've seen me laughing alongside and with, very occasionally at Joe, and you've seen me making silly talk and sharing ice cream with my bouncing Springer Spaniel George. You've seen someone engaging, sometimes funny, with a quirky, playful way with words and a vocabulary nearly as big as his beard. You'd maybe even describe him as extroverted. What you certainly wouldn't do is describe him as devoid of life. The following passage contains brief descriptions of violence towards a child. That's because I have a secret, and wrapped around it, keeping it from view, is the thing I call my mask. It's part of my survival mechanism. It's how someone with absolutely zero ability to trust any human, including the human they reside within, stays alive. You see, when I first came face to face with my acute stress response, I didn't fight. I couldn't. I was a 5-year-old kid. I didn't flee. I couldn't. I was literally locked into a bathroom stall. I didn't take fright. I couldn't. There was no one to startle and no one to hear. I didn't freeze or faint. I couldn't. If I'd done either, my murderer would have finished the job. No, I fawned. I ingratiated myself. I cooperated. I looked up into the face of a psychopath that was trying to kill me, and part of me figured out how to empathize with him. I learned really, really quick how to put on the mask. I've had it on ever since, just like I've had what I eventually learned was called hypervigilance on ever since. I have literally no memory of walking into any room on this planet, no matter how many times I've walked into that room, and not searching the room for weapons and exits and thinking about which way to face so I can fight or run if I have to. I didn't learn until my mid-20s that that wasn't normal, that it wasn't what everyone else did all the time too. Can you imagine how disconcerting, distressing, and freakishly alienating it feels to pick up a newspaper one morning and read an article and realize that your body has been forcing you your entire life to do the same things a veteran just spontaneously started doing after surviving a bomb blast that hurled ragged and red-hot steel through both her and the people who didn't survive around her? And that this isn't normal? That part of me exists because after the first time, those are the programs I want to run. I want my body to go straight, without hesitation, to first violence, then escape. Not fawning. Anything but fawning. Anything else, but not the mask. I learned on the first day of school that the mask is my default state. It's my most basic survival mechanism. And it's very, very effective. It's kept me alive. It's done more than that. By playing it against my persistent, ridiculously high hypervigilance, I've been able to be a really effective, really high-performing human being for significant parts of my life. Not most of it, not by a long shot, but for enough of it to make the sad, low-performing parts occasionally seem worthwhile. Together, they're how I learn new things really fast. They're how I walk into situations I don't understand and figure out how to survive and thrive in them. It's how I get people to like me, trust me, and believe me, to think I'm knowledgeable and intelligent, even when I know I'm just winging it and pathologically scrambling to stay alive. But the thing is, I also know that the mask can and will betray me. That in order to keep me alive, it will compromise me so badly that living isn't and wasn't worth it. My mask is willing to kill me to keep me alive. It's effective, it does its job, but it's robbed me of a life. That's precisely because No one ever explained to me that this is, as I've just struggled to explain, just one of several bog standard, always available alternative pathways that a human can just find themselves going down when confronted with overwhelming, inescapable horror. Of course, I can't escape my own contribution to that. I was too young and scared and ashamed to communicate what had happened. More than that, I literally didn't have the words for what had happened. It was in every sense, but especially the simplest possible one, unspeakable. Something I did not have either the words to say or the voice to say them with. But that fact doesn't really change anything. I didn't communicate successfully what had happened, so I never got the help I needed to understand the consequences that would inevitably follow. That meant I never got any instruction or hint that my developing mask and everything it hid underneath was just one normal way to adapt to what I only learned years and decades later was an extremely abnormal experience. And because no one ever stepped in to tell me what I couldn't just somehow know, I had to learn the hardest way just how easy it is for a wounded child to learn from unprepared adults that it's much, much safer to keep the secret and hide the wound than it is to let anyone even get a hint of what's happened. I had to discover what I now know to be true. This isn't the unsupported opinion of someone who barely knows what they're talking about. This is a statement of fact based on positive knowledge and expertise. That fawning response I grew to call the mask will do whatever is necessary for the body to survive, no matter how compromising or horrifying or vile that may be. And it simply doesn't care what the mind or the emotions or the body have to witness or endure along the way. It's literally lower down in our animal brain than what we think of as the mind or the emotions. This is the thing that makes a dog wag its tail at the man who has repeatedly whipped it. It's beneath and below what we think of as the things that make us human. Worse, left untreated without anyone to thank the mask for doing its job and to tell it against its protests that it's no longer needed and it's time to go to sleep, the mask will take over day-to-day management of whatever survived, of whatever or whomever remains. The following passage contains brief descriptions of violence towards a child. And now I've got to explain how I know what I know. The story my body tells me has always had the same elements, and it plays in a kind of loop. On my first day of school, I got on a bus. I was so excited. I wanted to learn, and it had become clear to me that school was the place where you learned, so I was ready, and I wanted to go to school so bad. I yearned to learn and to understand. And my body remembers that yearning so strong, I insisted on taking the bus, even though it was the first day of kindergarten and all the other kindergarten kids would be dropped off by their mothers. And my mother listened to my insistence, so she watched her son Mike get on that bus dressed in a shiny shirt and proud. And my body remembers that too, that long ago and far away feeling of pride. I know I sat at the front of the bus, in the first seat on the right, near the stairs, and the weird handle the driver could use to open and close the door the kids would step up at each stop. I was fascinated by that handle, trying to figure out how it worked, and I remember the bus driver was talking to me, but I can't remember his face or anything he said, just that he liked my shiny shirt. And my body remembers that too, how much I loved that shirt and how it felt against my skin. And then, suddenly, like a jump cut in a movie, the other kids are skipping ahead, but the man who's talked to me on the bus is guiding me into a bathroom. My body remembers the white of the urinals and a wet, cracked tile on the wall. It remembers the smell of those chemical cakes they put in urinals, that chemically stench, a stall door closing, and the harsh light glinting off of a comically large belt buckle. And then it remembers something bad happening, something unbearably bad, incalculably bad, something monstrous. And then I wake, like from a dream, with a pain in my throat and a bitter, metallic, coppery taste in my mouth, like what you'd feel if you licked the terminals of a 9-volt battery. And then I'm guided, stumbling. My body remembers it being hard to walk, like I couldn't control my feet, like I couldn't fully even see them or where they were walking, even when I looked down at them. and then I'm led through the door into class for some reason later than all the other students, even though some of them had arrived on the same bus with me. I was told to find a desk and sit down, but I didn't know the class was divided into first graders and kindergarten kids, so I just sat down at the wrong desk because I was bigger than kids my age, and I just selected the one near the kids my size that I'd seen on the bus. My body remembers all the children suddenly laughing and the teacher laughing too, and the unbearable weight of shame that descended like the hammer of God onto my shoulders at that moment, and how badly I wanted to cry as I moved to the right desk, but how something new simply wouldn't let me. My body remembers that my world had been shattered. It remembers all of this in my muscles and my sinew and my bones. It's let me feel it, but piecemeal and in disjointed parts, like it can't remember the sequence of events. My mind has had to string it all together to try and come up with an order, but my mind alone remembers only stepping on the bus, trying to understand the door handle, being guided for some reason late through the door into class, the pain of the classroom laughing, and then being forced to stumble through the Pledge of Allegiance alongside the noise of a bunch of first graders who for some reason already knew the words. And then my body and my mind vaguely remember, together, arriving home to a cake and crying and sudden rage and a mother who'd never see her son Mike again. The following passage contains brief descriptions of triggers and flashbacks. Of that first day of school, what hurts the most isn't what happened in that bathroom. It's that I can't remember it as a single cohesive story, because that's what everyone in my life, including me, has expected and even demanded in order to believe me ever since. I have no episodic memory of it, only these visceral body memories, which didn't arrive all at once or in a comprehensible order. I couldn't tell you what his face looked like, or what shirt he was wearing, but I know what parts of his body smelled like over the stench of those urinal cakes. I know he had a bright metal belt buckle on, that it was comically large, but I couldn't possibly tell you what that belt buckle looked like. I couldn't tell that belt buckle from any other if you sat them both down in front of me. I couldn't tell you for certain if it even was the bus driver or someone else who was walking by. The kind of memory everyone for some strange reason expects from a victim of violence, where there's a clear sequence of events and you hold on to useful and pertinent details, where you know what time and place something happened and could testify about it in a court of law, like a witness statement. I've got none of that. What I also don't have is the so-called recovered memories that were all over bad American daytime TV in the late 80s and early 90s. I never got hypnotized and coaxed by an untrained child psychiatrist to build up false episodic memories of ritual satanic abuse or demon possession. The memories I have weren't implanted. They're just jumbled. And they didn't show up through someone else's prompting. I've had them the whole time. I just couldn't talk or think about them. At first, because I didn't have the words. I literally didn't have the words. And then, once I got the words, because no one else wanted to hear them. So no, I don't have anything close to a movie or a photograph in my head, and that hurts much worse than what actually happened. That's why it took me more than 20 years to start even trying to disclose what I do remember and how I remember it, even to the people I should have been safest around and who had no call but to do anything but trust me. And it's taken me a lot more years to overcome the pain I felt when even those people didn't believe me. Every human arrives with a preconceived bias, even the professionals. And they've been taught by media, made by people with my kind of training, paid for by people with power and agendas, to expect something that feels like an ideal documentary and to assume that anything else is a fiction. They expect me and others who, like me, were children, to have a kind of memory that no one who has actually experienced these kinds of events as children could possibly have. I don't have an episodic documentary, and I don't have an episodic fiction. Instead, what I do have is what I've pieced together out of decades of slowly being able to inch in tiny increments closer to the things, my body and the mask it wears, have been trying to avoid letting me fully experience the whole time. What I do have came in dribs and drabs that showed up along the years as bodily memories that slowly revealed themselves to a mind that couldn't, and I suppose still can't, cope with them all at once. It's the outer truth of my secret, but what it isn't is my testimony. A lot of people, especially men, for some reason, want to think about justice and retribution in the first instance, and the risk of damage to some man's reputation in the second. And so they either want eyewitness testimony or they want to believe I'm making it all up. This isn't testimony. It's not DNA. It wouldn't convict a man, even if I knew his name. And the fact is, I wouldn't want that anyhow. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. The body remembers what the mind can't allow itself to. That's the core of PTSD in general, and CPTSD in specific. And what it remembers, no matter how vague and strange and unsettling and even distorted, it is still the truth. It just may not be the kind of truth that a justice system, more intent on punishing or exonerating the accused than it ever has been on helping the victim, can recognize. I learned that the hard way when, years after the fact, I had my first conscious experience of a flashback. In the same moment, I discovered to my horror that my body already knew a flavor it manifestly could not possibly have known except through one terrible path. One path that could only have happened on that first day of school, inside that bathroom stall. And in my muscles and in my senses and in my bones, I know that I was there, that I was present, and that the flavor I had and have had ever since in my mouth was real, and that it should never, ever have been there. Hi, again. I'm Michael, and I survived childhood sexual abuse. I use the finger quotes because while being a survivor is better than being a victim, I will only know for certain I've survived if and when I discover that I did not eventually die by my own hand. Unfortunately, at least in the several societies I've grown up and aged in, as a male with a history of dissociative CPTSD initiated by preschool childhood sexual abuse, there's a substantially elevated risk of exactly that happening. And that's why I'll never be completely comfortable using the terms survivor or male survivor. I am comfortable enough calling others who have experienced sexual violence survivors when I know that helps them, but for myself, it's easier and more accurate to say that my body survived and has continued to survive, at least so far. The following passage contains descriptions of childhood sexual abuse and physical violence towards a child. On some day in August 1980, on my first day of school, in a bathroom stall not far from my kindergarten class in Palmdale, California, the boy I knew as Mike was raped and then murdered. And that which remained is what eventually decided to use the name Michael. And to be clear, I'm not being figurative on either count here. My body knows very clearly that I was sexually penetrated against my will, that this was done, at least initially, using some kind of force and violence, and that at some point I was choked or otherwise suffocated to the point of unconsciousness. My 5-year-old body experienced that loss of consciousness as actual death, despite the fact that something else, something other, woke up again. The level of violence was, I learned many years later, really very unusual and marks me as an outlier. The following passage contains a general description of childhood sexual abuse victims and perpetrators. That's because my abuser wasn't someone known to me. They weren't someone with persistent access to me or the ability to groom me or otherwise capture my trust. Instead, it was a relatively straightforward, opportunistic act of overwhelming one-time violence by a stranger. After a lot of years of hearing the stories of others who endured sexual abuse as children, I eventually realized that my experience of stranger danger was and is exceedingly rare. In fiction, it's usually a stranger. But the reality is the opposite of what we've been told to think. The Vast majority of children who've been sexually abused and also survived the talk about it were emotionally coerced and manipulated by someone very close to them. Someone who had access and opportunities for interaction over a relatively long time and were either able to build trust or were already implicitly trusted. When it comes to male survivors specifically, it's only society's intellectual biases and its desire to insulate itself from the really common horrors by dredging up images of less common boogeymen that has you picturing a priest or a scout leader right now. The sort of random out-of-the-blue monster that changed the course of my life is virtually non-existent. And although authority figure abusers like priests and troop leaders and teachers, they really aren't exactly rare, but they're definitely not the most common or most realistic picture of an abuser either. The reality is that a child sexual abuser is almost certainly going to be someone very close to them, most often a family member. And if it isn't another child, then there's a very good chance it's their father, their uncle, their aunt, or their mother. In the sample of male survivors I've met personally and privately, a female abuser is roughly as common as a male, and their mother was by far the most common female abuser, but I've never seen either of those ideas reflected publicly in the media at all. And if it is another child, there's an odds-on chance that child was abused by one of those same adults first. In contrast, both my abuser and my abuse were really quite uncommon, which is why I'm saying I'm an outlier. Not to draw attention to myself or my experience, but to point out what I'm not and what I don't know. I have no experience of what it feels like to have been manipulated by someone who loved me, or I loved, into compliance, or to feel what I can only imagine is an incredible violation in the breaching of those kinds of familial trust, never mind what it must be like to have been violated in that way by the very people all the rules of society say are there to protect and care for and nurture you. I also don't know what it's like to have been betrayed by a trusted pillar of the community, by someone in religious or civil authority. Again, I can only imagine the damage that would do to a child's developing sense of self and community, not to mention faith or authority. When it comes to other children who've suffered sexual abuse as young as I did, I've never met another like me. I've never once met another who was harmed exclusively by stranger danger. What I have met is a lot of children seriously harmed by people close to them, people that should have been trusted, that they should have been able to trust. I really am the outlier, and I can't and don't dare speak for those children or their experiences because I don't share them. But what I can do is shed some light on just how badly I was mauled by what was really the most survivable and least traumatic form of childhood sexual abuse. Hopefully to draw some attention to what needs to be done for those who endured and are enduring right now, as I speak, the least survivable and most traumatic forms. What happened to me was both terrifying and horrifying. It was an experience of death, injury, and sexual violence, all three at once. It was the very definition of trauma. And it was absolutely going to cause significant and lasting damage. But like a through and through bullet wound that happens to miss somehow all the vital organs, horrific damage doesn't need to be fatal damage. Speaking only for myself, but in the hope of shedding some light on darker places, it's exactly because I didn't have all the extra complexity of family or community ties to my abuser that my trauma was really the through and through survivable kind. Properly treated, I was always going to have the psychological equivalent of a limp and scar tissue, but what I didn't need to do was lose my leg, much less my life. My trauma didn't necessarily have to develop into PTSD, and it certainly didn't have to become CPTSD. The problem is for that proper treatment to arrive, someone has to take responsibility for what had just occurred to me. When a 5-year-old boy gets raped and left for dead, someone is responsible for what happened. Really, more than that, someone is now responsible for what comes next, for either picking up the pieces and doing something to help that boy survive, or for putting him out of his miseries. The reason, more than 4 decades later, that I do have and still have CPTSD and that not a single day of my life since hasn't been lived in a body that feels that rape and that violence, is because that someone ended up having to be me. That idea might sound perverse, and let me tell you, at a very profound level that gets so much deeper than you can probably imagine right now, it really is very, very perverse. But the simple fact is that at 5 years of age, I became responsible, actually responsible for both my rape and my attempted murder. I've tried to explain that idea of responsibility before, both to the friends and family who care about me and to the professionals who I've ended up having to seek out and try to help me survive with my mental illness. And I usually end up facing a wall of well-intentioned but still kind of unthinking pushback. Even from people trained to the current state of the art in how to work with people with CPTSD, this usually shows up in another thought-terminating cliche. Something like, a child can't be responsible, or it wasn't your responsibility, or your abuser was the one who was responsible, or simply, it wasn't your fault. To me, as someone who endured what I endured, as young as I endured it, all of these are fundamentally both wrong and also unhelpful. But somehow they seem to protect the person saying them from having to face and then think about the darker, uglier truths. Well, sorry, but I never had the luxury of not facing and thinking about those truths. I had to start looking at them really close and really early, and I've put a lot of thought into them over a really long time. So allow me a moment to explain. I use the English language extremely precisely because what I'm trying to do is communicate. But actually communicate, not just convey. I am not trying to merely hand you my opinion. I am trying to bring your worldview into alignment with my own so that we are looking at the same page of the same book, so that we are in communion, literally sharing a perspective. The moment I was molested, especially because of how violently it occurred, I found myself in a very different story than the one most lives are playing out within. Looking at the world from a very different perspective. Think of me as a space probe sent off on a journey perpendicular to the normal one. I use precise words so I can communicate to you precisely what I've seen, and just like that probe, I may not have seen what you have seen, but I may have seen a lot of what you haven't seen. If you hear my precise words with imprecise meaning, all I'm doing is conveying, but not communicating. I may be being heard, but I'm not being understood. When most people use the word responsibility in this context, they usually mean culpability, and if not, they mean liability. Culpability is who is morally responsible for the harm, who should feel guilty for what occurred, who shoulders the burden of the blame. Liability is who is economically responsible for the harm, who must repay the debt incurred, who shoulders the burden of the costs. What neither addresses is who has the ability to respond, literally who has the response ability, who has the duty to do something about the harm, who shoulders the burden of picking up the pieces, treating the harm, and seeing no more harm occurs. The following passage contains a brief description of childhood sexual abuse and physical violence towards a child. In my case, the first two have stupidly simple answers. Culpability belongs to the man that molested me, and liability really belongs first to him, then to the school, and then to the state that employed him. But also, can anyone explain to me how knowing the answer to either question helps me in the slightest? Assigning culpability might have led to the nebulous idea of justice. It might have allowed someone to be punished. But you tell me how once his pants came down and he'd done what he did and then put his hands around my throat, putting a noose around his was going to help me in any way whatsoever avoid the worst effects of CPTSD. Assigning liability might actually have been helpful because it would have provided me with some resources. But my whole point is that those resources needed to be available immediately, not decades later if the statute of limitations hasn't already run out. Now, see, both of these are just meaningless distractions for someone still in the middle of just surviving the disaster that has happened, whose life has just been violently interrupted, and who desperately needs someone with the ability to respond to show up and do so. Culpability is who or what caused the dam to fail and the disaster to begin, Liability is who pays for the cleanup after the disaster is finished. In the middle is responsibility, and it doesn't have stupidly simple answers. Is there a dam below the one that failed? Is it strong enough to hold back the water? When it fails, is there another below that? Is there someone who witnesses the first failure, or the second, or the third? Can any of them get a message through to the city downstream in time? As long as the disaster is unfolding, there's someone or something that can shoulder some, if not all, of the responsibility, even if that ends up being you, just clinging to a tree and hoping your fingers don't give out before someone else arrives to claw the responsibility back. If no one and nothing else holds, if everything between disaster and you fails, then the responsibility falls on your shoulders. And if they're not strong enough, if you can't bear it, it'll fall through you onto someone else. I don't care about culpability or liability in the slightest, because neither of them addresses the problems of the harmed, or the harm the harmed can do. I only care about the chain of responsibility. It might sound very strange to hear this, but I forgave my abuser a long time ago for what he did to me. He bears culpability, sure, and though I doubt he could ever have contributed to my recovery, he bears liability. But he never had responsibility. He literally never had the ability to respond appropriately to having that child under his care, or he couldn't have done what he did. He should have had that responsibility. Definitely, no question. But the moment it dropped on his shoulders, something very weak, if not already broken inside his mind, snapped or slipped or just wasn't there, and he failed to be the one responsible for my care in a truly horrendous fashion, and my disaster began. His disaster, though, had merely gotten worse, maybe catastrophically so. And it's because I have some understanding of that, I can forgive him. Now, in this culture, the idea of forgiving someone that violently sexually assaulted a 5-year-old child is frankly a bit alien. I get that. But at the same time, I am the one person with the right to do so, and I've chosen to do so. I've chosen to believe he had CPTSD, but sadly was too weak and frankly pathetic to overcome whatever had in turn happened to him, probably during his own childhood, probably also involving the sexual violence of adults, probably adults very close to him, related to him. And so he passed his pain on down the generations, just like I've described. I am, of course, completely aware that might be my own confirmation bias. If I were to talk to him, I might discover that he was, in fact, just monstrous evil, temporarily wrapped up in human form by some god with an unfathomably complicated and kind of inhumane to me plan. The thing is, that sounds like a stupidly simple story and a thought-terminating cliche to me. And since I can't talk to him, I'll choose the more complex, but also more likely story, precisely because it lets me forgive him, because he's like me, if very sadly, with a lot less self-control. In my version of the story, he never had a hope of not doing what he did to me because his capacity for responsibility had been destroyed by a disease that wouldn't have a name until just a few years ago. A disease that started trying to infect me the moment we came into contact that day in August 1980. So if not to him, to whom did the responsibility for treating that disease fall? If there'd been someone who overheard us in that bathroom stall, then it would have fallen on them. But they either weren't there, or chose to dismiss what they heard but couldn't see. Next, it would have been the teacher, as I was dropped off at the class. But I'd assume a teacher on the first day of class marshaling a bunch of noisy kindergartners and first graders into caterwauling the Pledge of Allegiance just might not notice anything untoward about me, and saw a slightly late child being chaperoned by an otherwise familiar and trusted adult. As I've said, I've got essentially no episodic memory of that day, so the next people I'm aware of on whom the responsibility could or would possibly fall were, for better or worse, my parents. Anyone with any actual training on how to teach and interact with children had already escaped the path of the flood coming downhill, really just within minutes. Responsibility was about to crash down on the two people in my life who both had the most access to me and authority over me, and were also, comically, the two people least prepared by their society to take up that load. Now, let me make it clear. Nothing in me blames either my father or my mother for what happened next. Part of the reason for that is because I'm not interested in the distraction of culpability. What I actually care about is what went wrong in the chain of responsibility. Another part, if we're being honest, is because my CPTSD inhibits access to some of the emotional building blocks necessary to feel that blame in the first place. Mainly, though, it's because after basically making every conceivable error along the way and finding and backing out of all the intellectual and emotional dead ends, I eventually developed two skills that everyone just assumes are part of being human, but really aren't: compassion and empathy. Or at least I developed the ability to pretend at both enough that the results look the same as the real thing. With both of those skills and enough time and more effort, I learned enough about both my parents and their histories to understand that neither of them had ever had even the slightest hope of being ready to deal with what came home from my school that day. That each of them had their own experience of trauma, becoming PTSD, becoming CPTSD, and though the specific acts and violence are just lost to time in history, that they each had suffered as children of those who in turn had their own histories of the same. When finally, decades after the fact, I was able to disclose what had happened to me to each of them, what got reflected back was very clearly the same flawed alternative pathways, the same clusters of the same symptoms, echoes of the same attempts to badly manage and treat themselves, and the same shame at being harmed in the first place. Again, it could be my confirmation bias, but I choose to believe that what happened next wasn't because my parents were either inherently evil or inherently incompetent, but instead that their ability to be responsible for my care had been undermined and weakened by at least 2 generations of CPTSD, and that's what led to a third. When the thing I eventually started calling Michael came home that day, and my parents suddenly discovered that something highly traumatic had happened to them. And what could be more traumatic than an entirely different child coming home in the same body you'd seen your son leave in that morning? They reacted with their own flawed versions of the acute stress response. They more or less immediately started following automatic programs that were meant to ensure they survived. Unfortunately, those programs, operating on their unreasoning emotions at a level well below their conscious thinking selves, didn't actually acknowledge, much less care, if I survived. Now, what actually happened next played out over years, across multiple countries, and involved changing family circumstances and relationships. It involved a lot of biographical episodes and gory details that are really too specific to my personal experience to be of any use to you. I'm trying to walk you through my progression from childhood trauma to PTSD to CPTSD to the Fugoid, and ultimately this video, in the hope that that might help with recognizing trauma and the problems that develop from it going untreated in yourself, your family, or your friends. And it's hard to find that balance between secrets that should be exposed and things that really can just be left unsaid. I love both my parents, and that love means I don't feel it's right to speak for them, and I also don't want to speak badly about them. So all I can do here is try to summarize how the burden of responsibility hit them that day, how it overwhelmed them, and the ways that played out and how that responsibility ultimately passed on to me. I know they were both trying in their own ways, and with the skills, knowledge, and experience they had to be good parents. And I've never blamed them. I long ago forgave them. There's no culpability, liability, or responsibility there, but the pathway from my initial trauma to what became my CPTSD, leading up to today, flows through them and what I understand of their own complex relationships with trauma. It's easiest to speak of my father, both because he died some time ago and because I didn't actually know him very well. My parents divorced while my brother and I were still quite young, and we were estranged from my father for 25 years, until I finally decided to seek him out. Then 1 week after we met as adults, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and less than a year later he was gone. That means that a lot of the conversations I wanted to have and the questions I was hoping to get answers for, I just had to set aside. So I don't know much about his childhood, other than that there was some kind of brutality from his own father. Brutality that was somehow always tied to his father's religion. Apparently, my grandfather was quite a fan of spare the rod, spoil the child, and occasionally used that rod in ways and on parts of his children no God could ever have intended. I believe, but only through hearsay via my mother, my father never confirmed it directly, that he was also raped or molested in some way as a child by someone in his family. Just as we'd been estranged for most of my life, my father was estranged for most of his own family until just before his own father died. I know that my father had serious emotional control issues and difficulties with relationships when he was still a young man, and that he had a huge amount of anger in him, though he couldn't or wouldn't talk about where that had come from, and that it was joining the military that taught him discipline. I know he loved, to an obsessive degree, discipline, order, and control over chaos. He was a flight engineer, got into computing quite early, and was always building intricate objects and tinkering with precision tools and lathes and other machines. Anywhere he flew in the world, he'd use the same hotels and the same restaurants, where he'd order the same food. Because more than anything else, it seemed he wanted and needed consistency. From what he told me after we reconnected, he had learned to really, really hate inconsistency to what felt like an irrational degree. That was something he'd apparently had since childhood, but something in his experience as a helicopter mechanic in Vietnam had ratcheted that up. He could barely talk about the war, even having difficulty telling stories he remembered as funny. There were some things that objectively weren't funny that he couldn't talk about at all. Soon after the divorce, not long before I didn't see him again for a quarter of a century, he mentioned a bus stop and some kind of detonation, and then his eyes glazed over and started darting around, and his face flashed with something I've only ever seen in a mirror when I've had a flashback. My father definitely had severe, completely unacknowledged and untreated CPTSD on the day I came home from school. The war on its own had seen to that. What I don't know, and never got to ask about, was where some other behaviors of his came from. The things that were hidden, the things he compartmentalized, to the point that maybe only I ever knew about some of them. Maybe specifically because I'd gone to school, one quiet, calm, confident kid, and come home another screaming, tantrum-throwing, constantly reactive one, because I'd suddenly and shockingly become as inconsistent as possible. I don't know for sure if it actually started on that first day of school, but I don't have a single memory of a hug from my father or being carried on his shoulders from that first day of school in California until he left, and I wouldn't see him again for 25 years. Before that day, I have memories and photos of my dad being very affectionate with me. But it wasn't even months afterward that he started telling my mother that he couldn't touch me anymore because I'd grown too fat. I have a photo of myself at the end of that year. The idea that I was fat, or even slightly pudgy, is just utterly delusional. But something about his child suddenly being so completely out of control had so disturbed my father's equilibrium that his acute stress response kicked in. He was going to fight chaos with order, and once that couldn't be managed by just disappearing to work more often, that meant he was going to instill discipline in me by whatever means necessary. And that started by telling my mother it was time to put a perfectly normally shaped, healthy 5-year-old boy on a diet. The following passage contains brief descriptions of parental abuse of a child. It ended with beatings behind a closed door whenever I did anything that embarrassed him or made him feel stupid or out of control. Beatings in which I couldn't cry out, or they'd get worse. When he'd get so angry, he'd stop paying attention to which end of the belt he was using. They weren't frequent. My father wasn't a monster, and they only happened when I was particularly confrontational, emotional, or disrespectful, or embarrassed him professionally. But when they did occur, they were, in a word, consistent. Like he was automatically doing something he'd learned by rote. When I finally called him again a lifetime later, The first thing my father did was apologize for being a bad father, for not being present and providing for his children, and for the withdrawal of affection, specifically for me. He thought I was calling to confront him. He didn't understand that my CPTSD, being as bad as it eventually became, meant that I couldn't fathom as a child, and can only intellectually understand now, that I didn't deserve the withdrawal, the absence, or the violence. It helped that he'd grown enough to acknowledge that he had failed at the basic job. What I always wanted to ask him, but I didn't have time or opportunity, was why even then he couldn't acknowledge the belt strokes or the slap across my face. Why, if I hinted at them, he'd look blankly bewildered, as if he couldn't remember them at all. Why, in that moment, I'd recognize my mask on his face. I do love my father, and I don't want to imply he's the villain here, because he wasn't. He was objectively a bad father, and he was an extremely bad husband to my mother, and he admitted to both, but he wasn't a bad man. There are no bad men. There are just weak men with bad justifications for their actions, and my father cocked up both of those jobs because he hadn't been given anything but bad preparation for either. He certainly wasn't prepared for what had happened to me. In truth, he wasn't prepared for finding out about the details 3 decades later either. And when responsibility landed on his shoulders, they broke, and it cascaded down onto mine, bringing some of his legacy of violence along with it. I have forgiven all of what came afterward, including all the details I've left out, but it did take what was a survivable one-time trauma and help turn it into years of neglect, hunger, and occasional abuse that I couldn't fight and couldn't flee from, couldn't escape until my parents divorced. The reason I could forgive that was because I recognized in him something just as wounded as I'd been, something just as violently angry and desperate for control and discipline. I don't know the specifics. That was his journey, and I never got to ask and wasn't in a position to push or force it out. What I do know is my grandfather found whatever control he had through religion, that my dad couldn't quite get that to work and so leaned on the military for his own, and that both of them were at times very brutal to at least one of their sons. In both cases, their external sources of control simply didn't work. It's harder to speak of my mother, not just because she's still alive, but because she's the one who tried, who always tried and is still trying, and who stuck around. Every year, it's my mom I thank on both Mother's Day and Father's Day, because after my dad disappeared, she was forced to take up both jobs. And though it took some time after the divorce for her to find herself again, eventually she grew into both roles and did them well, really well. I love my mother so very much, in ways so much richer and deeper than anything I have ever felt or currently feel or could ever have felt for my father. That's why it's very hard to explain how, once the burden of responsibility slammed into her own acute stress response at the time ended up tearing open and shoving bacteria into what was already a just barely survivable wound in me. Unlike my father, who basically just abandoned his post once I came home explosively hyperreactive, my mother really tried to understand what had happened to me that day. She did feel the responsibility, and though she hadn't been remotely prepared enough to actually succeed, she tried to take the strain. She recognized something serious had happened, but she didn't know how to get me to explain what had happened any more than I had words to do so. She could barely get me to calm down between what became more and more frequent tantrums and outbursts. And in the 1980s, a mother trying to draw attention to her kids' sudden behavioral shifts without her husband's support was kind of automatically labeled hysterical. In their minds, I'd been chaperoned from the bus to class, and nothing could have happened, and nothing would be investigated. And that was it. The school just washed its hands. My mom just had a problem child. When her husband just accepted that and disappeared into work more often and stopped offering any kind of support, her capacity for responsibility started to crack. When my father started saying that he couldn't touch me anymore, specifically because I was, in his delusion, getting too fat, that capacity crumbled utterly.
The following passage contains brief general discussion of eating disorders.
I do know quite a bit about my mother's childhood. I know her parents were functioning alcoholics, though this is so common in the town she returned us to after the divorce that I think of myself as a functioning alcoholic who will just never be drunk. I know she's had an eating disorder for most of her life, and I know that because she taught it to me. She'd learned disordered eating at the hands of her own mother, and I know this in turn because my grandmother spent most of my teenage years cackling the same litany of insults and derision at me for my weight as she did at my mother for hers. Eating disorders run in a straight line from me through my mother, through my grandmother, all the way to at least my great-grandmother, who did something unspeakable involving food to my mother before she'd even reached preschool age. Something she can't recall at all, but that rendered her so bodily terrified of having unfamiliar flavors in her mouth that it took me more than a decade of meticulous effort to gain enough trust to get her to try anything new at all. That's how I started to realize that my mother also has what eventually got named as CPTSD. The flash of horror on her face at even the thought that something that tastes bad might have entered her mouth is just too similar to what flits across my face when I realize there's something that tastes metallic and bitter. Even before I learned that terms like hypervigilance, flashbacks, dissociation, and PTSD applied to me, my mother and I would talk about the ways in which seemingly random inputs and stimulus could cause both of us, in our own ways, to suddenly experience huge waves of intrusive, confusing emotions and thoughts. That we both had triggers that, if pulled, would set off an explosion that we wanted to avoid, and that we could avoid them by gorging ourselves on food. Triggers that were somehow associated with childhood horror that was so fuzzy and indistinct as to be literally unspeakable. My mother grew up in a time when the notion of PTSD only existed under the name shell shock, and could only apply to men who'd experienced the chaos and violence of war, men like my father. Though because he wasn't a combat soldier, even the extremely traumatic experiences he'd had in Vietnam, just a few months before he'd been discharged and my parents met, weren't sufficient to warrant treatment of any sort. In the same manner, my mother's, in hindsight, obvious CPTSD went unrecognized and untreated for decades by the time I stepped, terrified, off the bus from my first day of school. My mother tried to shoulder the burden of responsibility. She wanted, with all her might, to get her child back, to see her Mike again. She did everything in the very small amount of power available to an expatriate Canadian housewife in California in 1980 to try and understand what had happened to me and get me treated and get my mangled self set right. She did that because at some level, for some reason not available to my father, she knew something bad had happened to her son and that his sudden emotional inconsistency was something to address, not something to ignore, then discipline, and eventually try to shame or beat out of existence. What she didn't know was that the moment my father implied he wouldn't love me anymore if I didn't lose weight, which was the same thing he'd been saying to her about her own weight since shortly after they married, which in turn echoed what her own mother had both said and acted upon when she was a child. She'd flipped to her own acute stress response. She didn't fight. She couldn't. She was a woman, and he was a man. She didn't take flight. She couldn't. She was a mom to two boys in a country she could only legally stay in with her husband. She didn't take fight or freeze. She has the same default state as me. She fawned. She acquiesced, and she cooperated. She thought she was protecting me by doing whatever it would take to not let me have to survive what she'd had to survive, the loss of a parent's love because of her weight gain. And that flawed program ensured that not only did what I'd actually survived not get addressed or treated at all, but I ended up having to survive what she had survived too.
The following passage contains brief descriptions of eating disorders.
That is how and why my parents started restricting my food intake while I was already thin but still growing. A few months after I'd experienced death, serious injury, and sexual violence, all before I'd even finished kindergarten. My parents were both trying to do their best, but faced with an unfamiliar alien child that had come home acting like the world had shattered, and his definitely had, they each reverted to their own automatic, self-focused, self-protecting survival mechanisms. And by doing so, left me to fend for myself when it came to what had actually harmed me. They abandoned the burden of responsibility, and now there was no one left to take it up. It landed on me. No child is prepared to grow up quickly enough to bear that kind of responsibility correctly. In fact, no child is in any sense even capable of growing up that quickly. What they are capable of doing is maturing far too rapidly in an undirected, scattered, and dangerously incomplete manner by simply skipping over or radically abbreviating important stages of development that normal children with normal experiences naturally get to proceed through. Getting to the kind of maturity and knowledge required to actually carry the whole load of childhood sexual abuse when you have to do it alone takes a literal lifetime. Getting to the point you can shove in some rough supports and try and hold bits of it up and keep the whole disastrous mess from crashing down at once, you can start doing that shockingly quickly. But what I learned the hard way is your body does that by prioritizing. And it now cared a lot more about keeping me fed than it gave a damn about whatever had happened in that bathroom. To a growing kid's body that's suddenly faced with hunger and an artificially restricted food supply, the one-time violence of being raped in a bathroom at 5 years of age is nothing. That's probably why, to this day, it still feels like just that, nothing, in comparison to what came after. It's taken me a long, long time and a lot of effort to get to the point where I finally feel it's time to tell at least 25,000 people, and who knows how many more, that it happened to me. But that's not because it's the important event. It's not. It's just the thing that came first, and explaining what came after means explaining what came first. The sudden shock and violence of stranger danger, of nearly having ended, is nothing compared to being forced against my will, completely against my will, and by the two people society empowers with the legal ability to give my consent for me to starve. And starving me was exactly what they were doing. The moment my dad and my mom started to constrain the food supply of a growing, then 6-year-old boy, they were cutting that body off from the resources it needed to keep accelerating up that growth curve. So in trying to keep me from gaining any more excess weight, which again existed only in my dad's delusional mind, what they accomplished was, in net effect, forcing me into my first crash diet. For every pound I lost, my hunger amplified. For every pound I didn't gain that I was supposed to gain, my hunger amplified. And that is how I learned what starvation feels like. And a starving thing will eat. It will think of nothing but food. It will do anything necessary to get that food. Before I even reached the first grade, the ability to control my pitch was sheared right off. I was on an uncontrolled phugoid, heading towards what my flight engineer father, if he was still alive, would call uncontrolled flight into terrain. And I will never, ever leave it.
The following passage contains descriptions of disordered eating by a child and symptoms of body dysmorphia.
That summarizes how my parents' automatic reaction took me straight from traumatic event to PTSD to CPTSD by turning a single, devastating, but treatable injury into an untreated, seeping mess, and then into something first gangrenous and then infectious, all because they couldn't bear that responsibility because they hadn't been prepared to do that by either society or their own equally damaged and unprepared parents, and therefore ended up rubbing what they'd already been infested with into my open wounds, and they kept rubbing it in over and over for years. Because once these cycles of reliving and avoidance and reactivity start, they just keep on cycling over and over. Fugoid. I can't and don't need to tell you all the details of the years of progressively more disordered eating, of my attempts to control my weight, or of the insatiable, agonizing hunger that brought with it, or of the bullying my weight fluctuations brought with them, as all of that would take all day. But for anyone who still has doubt, who still can't empathize, and who still doesn't want to believe in what my body's memories tell me are the truth behind the event that just started me towards CPTSD, one thing I absolutely do have crystal clear, perfectly formed, absolutely could testify about it in court if it would or could ever matter episodic memories of, is sneaking into the cupboard below the counter where the flavorless rice cakes my mother and I were allowed by my father to eat were stored. Above the counter was the cupboard full of cookies and cakes and chocolate that were for him and my brother. But I knew, and to this day my body and its muscle memory still knows, that if anything was ever found missing, and you had better believe he kept an inventory, it was me that would, in secret, get another smack across the face or a belt across my bottom, regardless of who took it. In the back of that cupboard, below that counter, though, was something that had some flavor and fat and a consistency that was better than styrofoam. And when I was hungry enough and there was no one around to see, and my already hypervigilant senses were scanning the whole house to check, that's when my mind, absolutely terrified of getting caught, ended up watching my body literally cramming pet food into its mouth as fast as it could manage. I spent parts of my childhood so hungry because I was being forced to lose weight I didn't actually have to lose, at least at first, that I acted like an animal, and I ate an animal's food, and though it was a big step up from the rice cakes that weren't even a human's food, I felt guilty for it. I felt shame for it. Tremendous, unbearable shame. I felt like I deserved to be punished for betraying my parents and breaking their rules, for what my growing body and its growing hunger literally forcing me to do. It's been 40 years and I still do. I still know precisely what pet food tastes like, and that's just one more piece of visceral knowledge my body has, but isn't supposed to have. Food restrictions forced on you by someone else constitutes torture, and in the right circumstances is a war crime. I wasn't being starved to death. I was being starved to someone else's delusion, and eventually the extra hunger forced me to force more calories than I needed down my throat, and that drove me up, and so I started to look like the delusion. So the delusion got worse, and the calorie counting got more and more rigid, and then the urge to compulsively eat got more and more violent. Fugoid. I don't even know when I stopped being able to see anything in the mirror but the delusion. But I do know that if you saw and described my body today, it wouldn't bear any relationship whatsoever to how I'd either see it or describe it. I literally cannot see in the mirror what you'd see in that same mirror. Thank you for listening to my First Education, the third episode of this 8-part series. My story continues in episode 4, my second education, available now.